Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be talking about Japanese folklore, specifically the Kappa.
Yeah, and they're just fascinating creatures. I mean, there are all these different ways to look at them. So many different stories.
So where should we even begin? I mean, we've got websites and books and even found this great animated story on YouTube.
Well, I think the best place to start is with their name Kappa.
Okay, so what does that even mean?
It literally translates to water child. Pretty straightforward, right?
Water child.
Ah.
Okay, so I'm already picturing like some cute little kids splashing around.
Well, not exactly. I mean, they're about the size of a small child, but that's where the cuteness ends.
Oh, okay, so what do they actually look like?
Imagine like a weird mix of a turtle and a lizard scaly skin, usually green or blue, sometimes even yellow.
Okay, that's a little different than what I was picturing.
Oh, and they also have this shell on their back, just like a turtle.
Okay, so like a turtle kid with scaly skin. Got it.
But it gets weirder. They've got webbed hands and feet and a beak-like mouth.
Okay, now that's getting a little creepy.
Oh, and the most important part, they have this bowl-shaped indentation on top of their head.
A bowl on their head, what for?
It's called a sera, and it's always filled with water. That water is the source of their power.
So it's like their fuel tank or something.
Exactly. If that water spills, they lose all their strength. They're basically helpless.
Interesting. So they're powerful, but also vulnerable in a way.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so fascinating. They're this mix of strength and weakness.
And I bet that duality plays into a lot of the stories about them.
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes they're portrayed as mischievous tricksters playing harmless pranks.
Like what kind of pranks?
Oh, things like mimicking sounds or looking up women's kimonos.
Okay, so a little creepy, but not exactly dangerous.
Right. But then there are stories where they're much more menacing.
Oh, so what do they do in those stories?
Like drowning livestock, kidnapping children, and sometimes even assaulting women.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely taking a dark turn.
And then there's the whole shirikadama thing.
Shirikadama? What in the world is that?
It's this mythical jewel that's supposedly located in the anus and contains a person's life force.
Okay, that's a little too much information for me.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing, and some Kappa are said to try and steal it.
So they're not just tricksters, they can be, like, seriously dangerous.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Even though they can be menacing, they're also bound by tradition and politeness.
So they're like polite monsters.
Kind of. It's one of their biggest weaknesses. If you bow to a Kappa, they're compelled to bow back.
Tell me what happens when they bow.
They spill the water from their sera and lose all their power.
So it's like a monster etiquette test bow, and you disarm them.
Exactly. It's this weird mix of terrifying and hilarious.
So we've got these potentially dangerous creatures obsessed with good manners. It's a lot to process.
It is. But it gets even more complicated because Kappa haven't always been villains in these stories.
Oh, really? So they have a good side, too.
Well, good might be a stretch, but some legends say they actually helped humans.
Okay, like what kind of help?
Some say they taught ancient Japanese tribes important skills like bone setting and making medicinal salves.
So they're like gruff teachers with hidden hearts of gold.
Maybe something like that.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the whole thing about cucumbers.
Cucumbers. What do cucumbers have to do with Kappa?
People used to write their family names on cucumbers and toss them into the water as offerings.
Offerings for what? To appease the Kappa?
Exactly. It was a way to acknowledge their power and hopefully gain their protection.
So, here's a cucumber. Please don't drown our kids.
Pretty much. It's both hilarious and terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I can see that. But you mentioned this animated story earlier. What's that all about?
This YouTube video tells the story of a Kappa who's seeking redemption. It's set during a drought, and the villagers capture this Kappa, hoping to end the drought.
Okay, so how does the Kappa fit into this drought situation?
Well, instead of begging for its life, the Kappa remembers an encounter with a compassionate monk.
A monk.
Okay.
So what does the Kappa do?
It offers to pray for rain in exchange for its freedom.
So it's like a bargain with the villagers.
Exactly. The Kappa wants to do something good to make up for its past misdeeds.
Wow, that's a pretty selfless act for a creature that's usually portrayed as mischievous or dangerous.
It is. And what's even more incredible is that the Kappa's prayer actually works. The rain comes pouring down, ending the drought.
So the Kappa saves the village. That's amazing.
It is, but there's a tragic twist. The effort of channeling such powerful magic kills the Kappa.
Oh no, so it sacrifices itself to save the village.
Exactly. And the villagers are so moved by its selfless act that they believe it'll be reincarnated as a human.
Wow. That's both beautiful and heartbreaking. It really challenges the way we think about Kappa.
It does, and it shows that even creatures often portrayed as monsters are capable of great compassion.
Okay, so we've got spooky stories, acts of self-sacrifice, and cucumbers. It's a lot to take in, but it makes me wonder, where did the myth of the Kappa even come from?
Well, there are a few theories. Some believe Kappa were just cautionary tales used to keep kids away from dangerous waters.
That makes sense. Don't go swimming alone or the Kappa will get you.
Exactly. It's a classic parenting tactic. But there are other darker theories, too.
Oh, like what?
There's a theory that links Kappa to the tragic reality of leech babies.
Leech babies? What does that even mean?
It's a really sad theory. It suggests that the Kappa myth might have originated from the practice of impoverished families abandoning infants in rivers and ponds.
Oh, wow, that's heartbreaking. And it definitely adds a whole new layer of meaning to the Kappa's association with kidnapping children.
It does. And then there's the theory that the Kappa myth was inspired by the Japanese giant salamander.
A giant salamander. How would that work?
Well, these salamanders can grow up to 5 feet long, and they share some physical similarities with Kappa.
So people might have seen these giant salamanders and thought they were Kappa.
Exactly.
Huh.
Especially back then when people didn't have a scientific explanation for everything.
Okay, so we've got spooky stories, a possible link to a heartbreaking historical reality, and a giant salamander lurking in the shadows. It's amazing how a single myth can have such diverse origins.
It is. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've only just begun to explore the fascinating world of the Kappa.
Well, lucky for us, this deep dive isn't over yet. When we come back, we'll be exploring more stories, examining the Kappa's cultural significance, and maybe even figuring out how to win a sumo wrestling match against one. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our Kappa Deep Dive.
We've been talking about all these different theories about where Kappa stories come from. It's wild. But I keep thinking back to that idea of them being like cautionary tales to scare kids.
Right, like stay away from the river or the Kappa will get you.
Exactly. But I feel like there has to be more to it than that. I mean, these stories have been around for centuries. There must be something else going on.
Oh, definitely. I think those cautionary tales were just one part of it. I mean, think about it. Back then, people didn't really understand how nature worked.
So you're saying Kappa stories were a way to explain the unexplainable?
Exactly. Like strong currents or hidden depths in the water, things that could be really dangerous.
That makes sense. It's easier to blame a mischievous creature than to try and understand the science behind it.
Right. And the Kappa, with their unpredictable nature, they were the perfect scapegoat.
So they kind of represented the fear of the unknown.
In a way, yeah. And that fear was very real. I mean, people relied on the rivers and ponds for food and water, but they were also dangerous places.
Like this weird mix of dependence and fear.
Exactly. And the Kappa embodied that duality perfectly.
It makes me wonder if those cucumber offerings weren't just about appeasing a creature, but more about acknowledging the power of nature itself.
That's a really interesting point. Like maybe it was a way for people to try and make peace with the forces they couldn't control.
Right. Because even if you don't believe in Kappa, you still have to respect the power of the river.
Exactly. And that respect is a big part of Japanese culture.
Which brings us back to the Kappa's obsession with politeness. It's not just a funny quirk, is it?
Not at all. It really highlights the importance of etiquette in Japanese society. Even when dealing with supernatural beings, politeness is key.
So it's like this cultural code that's woven into their folklore.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that these stories weren't just for entertainment. They were a way to transmit cultural values.
And maybe even some practical advice for dealing with dangerous situations.
Right. Like, if you encounter a Kappa, remember your manners.
It's like the ultimate test of politeness. Can you be respectful even when you're terrified?
Exactly. And that respect might just save your life.
Okay, so we've got cautionary tales, cultural values, and maybe even some life-saving advice. It's amazing how much depth there is to these Kappa stories.
It is. And we haven't even touched on everything. There's still so much to explore.
Like that whole thing about Kappa teaching humans important skills. It's like they have this weird sense of honor.
Right. It's like they're testing people, seeing if they're worthy of their knowledge.
Maybe it's their way of making amends for all the trouble they cause.
Possibly. Or maybe they just enjoy messing with humans. It's hard to say for sure.
That's true. Kappa are full of surprises. But one thing's for sure, they're never boring.
Definitely. And that's why they continue to fascinate us. They challenge our expectations and make us question what we think we know about the world.
Speaking of challenging expectations, I wanted to bring up that animated story again. The one with the Kappa who sacrifices itself to save the village.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful one. It really shows a different side to Kappa.
Right. It makes you realize that even creatures often portrayed as monsters are capable of great compassion.
Exactly. And that complexity is what makes Kappa so interesting. They're not just one-dimensional villains. They're multifaceted beings with their own unique code of conduct.
And sometimes that code of conduct leads them to do incredibly selfless things.
Like giving their own life to save others? It's
Yeah.
pretty remarkable.
It is. And it makes you wonder if maybe there's a little bit of Kappa in all of us, that potential for both mischief and compassion.
That's a really interesting thought. Maybe we all have that duality within us.
Right, the capacity for both good and bad. It's just a matter of which side we choose to embrace.
And that's a choice we make every day, whether we're facing a fearsome Kappa or just navigating the everyday challenges of life.
Well said. So as we continue our deep dive into the world of the Kappa, we're not just learning about mythical creatures, we're learning about ourselves too.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of exploring folklore. It's a journey of self-discovery as much as it is a journey into the unknown.
And on that note, we'll be right back after a short break to wrap up our exploration of the Kappa and all their fascinating complexities. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of the Kappa. I gotta say, this has been one of our most interesting dives yet.
Yeah, it's amazing how these creatures can be so terrifying and yet so strangely endearing at the same time.
Exactly. And it makes me wonder, why are we still so fascinated by Kappa after all these centuries? What is it about these creatures that continues to capture our imaginations?
Well, I think it's because they represent something that's both familiar and completely alien to us.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, on one hand, Kappa embodies the untamed aspects of nature, the raw power and unpredictability that we both revere and fear.
So they remind us of the forces that are bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. But on the other hand, they also possess these very human qualities, like their obsession with politeness and their capacity for both mischief and compassion.
So they're like a mirror, reflecting back at us both the best and worst aspects of humanity.
Precisely. And that's what makes them so compelling. They challenge us to confront our own complexities and to see the world through a different lens.
And maybe that's why Kappa stories have endured for so long. Because they offer us a way to explore these universal themes of good versus evil nature versus culture, and the struggle to find balance between the two.
Exactly. They're not just stories about monsters. They're stories about ourselves.
And they remind us that even in the darkest of times, there's always the potential for redemption and hope.
Like in that animated story we discussed where the Kappa sacrifices itself to save the village, it's a powerful reminder that even creatures often portrayed as monsters are capable of great acts of kindness.
And that even the smallest of creatures can make a huge difference in the world.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of the Kappa, I encourage you to keep exploring. There's a whole universe of fascinating creatures and stories out there just waiting to be discovered.
And who knows, maybe you'll even encounter a Kappa yourself someday. Just remember to pack a cucumber and brush up on your bowing etiquette.
And always keep an open mind, because the world is full of surprises, and sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the greatest discoveries.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the Kappa. Until next time, keep exploring and keep those cucumbers handy.